Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are doing another Patron questions video, and this one is looking at some vehicles which would be cool to see in War Thunder if they expand into what would be deemed as unfinished prototypes, or even, expanding into stuff such as paper or fictional vehicles. And this is predicated on a change made to the rules on the stuff which was suggested to the developers. Obviously, I do the Past the Developer series on the YouTube channel, and this is based off a forum suggestion set which is published every month by the team over there of stuff which is passed to the developers. There was a rule change that was made where basically paper fictional vehicles will not be accepted, but unfinished prototypes, so stuff such as vehicles which were partially constructed or vehicle specific parts which were built, e.g. stuff like guns and power plants were built, those can get suggested. And the question from Conte Baraka is basically, what vehicles, if War Thunder decided to go down this route, would you like to see? Now, as just an official opinion on this, I generally don't want to see these vehicles, but these are the most interesting ones to me to read about when it comes to their history, when it comes to their ideas. So yeah, let's get started with a German massive machine that you can see before you. This is the Panzerkampfwagen 7 Löwe, or the Löwe, or however you say it. It is the Lion. And basically this is the main competition that was designed to go up against the Maus when the heavy tank production side, or super heavy tank production side of Germany started kicking off in the early 40s. The German super heavy tank projects actually started in 1941. Krupp started some studies into the super heavy Soviet tanks of the era, and basically they came up with a bunch of specifications that they wanted to design a tank around. This was in November of 1941. The new tank, it would require 140 millimeters of front armor, 100 millimeters of side armor, be able to go 44 kilometers an hour, and this would be based off a torpedo boat engine, the 1,000 horsepower Daimler-Benz marine engine, which was used on the Schnellboot, which we actually have in game. It would have a 5-man crew, 3 in the turret and 2 in the hull, and obviously it would weigh up to 90 tons. This thing was going to be an absolute behemoth. And after designing the specifications for this thing in the early months of 1942, Krupp started the process of completely designing the tank, which would then become this machine, the VK7201. And this was based off a previous project, which was known as the VK7001, which was created to compete with the Porsche designs, which included the first Maus designs, which were around. The 7001 was actually going to be armed with either a 150 millimeter gun, an L37 or L40, or a 105 millimeter KWK L70. And the idea of this, the Löwe, was to utilize Tiger II components in it, so therefore the production would be much easier to do instead of creating something from scratch. The designers at Krupp came up with two ideas. So you would have a light version, which would be known as the Leicht, and then you had a schwer version, which would be known as the heavy. The light version would have armor protection of up to 100 millimeters and only weigh 76 tons, whereas the schwer version would have 120 millimeters of armor protection and would weigh up to 90 tons. And both variants at this point would be armed with the 105 L70 and also a coaxial machine gun. So right now, basically looking at these designs, the general idea of it would be that the gun was made, and also the coaxial, and also the engine was all made. So that is its basis when it comes to reality. When it comes to the 90-ton version, though, the turret was supposed to be mounted centrally, which is basically the design that you see here. This is the most common design that you see of the Löwe, and that's basically because of the fact that in World of Tanks, it kind of resembles this, and also, you know, this is generally the one which is seen as correct, but there were many different designs of this thing. And when you look at the heavy version of it, the heavy version was actually designed slightly differently, and this is where it gets really complicated when it comes to this machine. Now, both of these at this point of development would be around about less than 30 kilometers an hour. They were not fast enough compared to what was going on. So Hitler actually stepped in, had a look at the designs, and he said, drop the light version, let's focus all our efforts on the heavy version. Hitler had this idea that these super heavy tanks were going to change the war. They were going to be the ones which put Germany on the map, let's say, when it came to combat. He was obviously completely wrong, but the fact was, obviously had to listen to him. So therefore it was redesigned, and it was going to carry a 150mm L40 or a 150mm L37, which would probably be the KWK 44 L38, which was around at the time, and its frontal armor would have the 140mm, and also it would have wider tracks, so therefore it would be able to actually, you know, move about, and also have the speed increased to 30 kilometers an hour. Now, in late 1942, this vehicle was actually cancelled, or the development of it was cancelled, in favour of the Mouse. And they decided, so obviously the Mouse had won that project, you know, they went forward with that, we all know about the Mouse, but they decided, okay, so we have this basis of the plan, why can't we just push forward and try and develop the Tiger II in an improved sense? So then the Löwe project became a better version of the Tiger II. That was the main focus. Here is another representation of what the Löwe could have looked like, because as I said before, there were tons of different designs rolling around. By February to May of 1942, there were 6 different designs which were considered for this, and the general considerations were an 88mm KWK L71. It would have 140mm of frontal armor protection, and then it would also be able to go at 35 kilometers an hour and weigh once again 90 tons. The power plant it was supposed to use was the Maybach HL 230P30. This would give it 800 horsepower. And obviously it would be quite a large vehicle, and it was planned to replace the Tiger II. But then, eventually, on the March 5th of 6th of 1942, the order for the heavier tank was placed, which was of course the Mouse, and the Project Löwe was stopped in July of 1942. So this machine never reached the prototype stage, but it did help in the design of the Mouse, and also extra designs on other vehicles. One thing to note about this is there were parts of it which were built, but obviously for different projects further down the line. That is why it kind of fits, but it is the most dodgy when we look at these vehicles. I just really like the design concepts which were brought up with this machine, which is why I'm a fan. Now, let's talk about something on the other side of things when it comes to these super heavy, massive vehicles. The British. So the British created a pretty interesting design when it came to dealing with a threat which was very worrying to them. So first of all, one thing that we have to get out the way is this is the FV215. Right, you can see it here. This is the general idea of it. This is different to another vehicle which a lot of people mistake for the FV215, which is this from World of Tanks. This is the FV215B. This is a completely fictional vehicle, and I'm guessing, I suppose it's based off of this, but the main thing is a lot of people look at this and think about, oh, this is the FV215. No, this is a separate thing which is completely fake. So we're going to be focusing on the FV215, which was the actual project which was designed. So in 1945, something happened. And that one thing that happened was the Berlin Victory Parade. And in the Berlin Victory Parade, what was decided by the Soviets is that they were going to show off the IS-3. And when the IS-3 came rolling down, that gave quite a lot of other nations a shock. To be honest with you, a lot of people, there was a lot of friction at the end of the Second World War. It was theorized that maybe the Soviets would just keep going west, you know, they would keep pushing through and actually create an extension of World War II against some of the other powers such as France, Britain, and America. But it was also worried that America would want to push through and deal with the Soviet Union. So there was always this worry what was going on, and the IS-3 was one of those vehicles which was shown that people became incredibly worried about. It had really well-sloped armor, it obviously had the pike nose on it, it had a massive gun, and a lot of people looked at it as if, oh god, what do we do against this thing? Because you've got to remember at the time, especially Britain didn't really have a vehicle to be able to deal with something like the IS-3. Now, the IS-3 eventually, it's never really lived up to the potential that it was actually billed as when it came to the heads of stuff like Britain, France, and America. And America actually built and developed something to deal with it. You know, the M103 came about. The French experimented with stuff like the AMX-50, which had a bunch of different design decisions. And when it came to Britain, well, Britain was in a pretty bad spot by the end of the war. They shicked together a charioteer, the charioteer Mark 7. That is obviously the machine that has the Cromwell hull in the game. It also has access to the 20-pounder gun. This was designed very quickly to be able to deal with a threat such as the IS-3 if it had come across, you know, the line. Now, obviously that didn't happen, thank God, because that machine would have got mauled. But but while that was going on, the British decided, okay, we need to work on better projects to deal with these things. So they made the Conqueror. The Conqueror obviously being the FV214, you know, we know it in game, and also the Super Conqueror, which was, you know, I mean, if you want to, historically, it's a bit of a grey area when it comes to Super Conqueror, so we'll just, you know, focus on the Conqueror. The Conqueror was, you know, an incredibly large vehicle. It had really nice armor on it. It had a very large turret. It had a very powerful gun. It was pretty much designed to be able to combat something like an IS-3 running at it, and it would have done that incredibly well. But the decision was made to actually push further into another idea which would have eventually replaced the Conqueror, and that is where we get to this machine, the FV215. The FV215 takes a lot of ideas from the Conqueror, but it is a completely unique vehicle in its sense, and it was built at least as a mock-up, which you can see before you. And also, it was built with the ideas of, like some of the internal components were made for it because they were actually going to design a full-on prototype. So what does this thing have? Well, it has the 183mm. Now, the 183mm is actually in-game. It's on the FV4005. You can actually find it already there. So that was built. They also made a bunch of the gun masks that you can see, and the general ideas, as I said, is they would take something like the Conqueror chassis, they would modify it, so this isn't exactly a Conqueror chassis, but it's very similar to it. The layout of it is very similar, but the dimensions are slightly different. When it comes to it, it used the same suspension, you know, it used a very similar engine as well at the time, and also, you know, it's the turret, though, was definitely not as strong. There isn't actually any armor thicknesses for the front of it, but it was supposed to deal with a 100mm gun at a 30-degree angle, basically. That was generally the idea of the front of the turret. The sides and the back would have 17mm of protection. So this is very much a front-on machine. Now, this thing, as you can see, was built up in a mock-up, and the build machine actually modeled all the internals as well. It modeled everything that was designed, you know, to be inside of it, and it would have been powered also by the Rolls-Royce Meteor, the Rover M120 number 2 Mark 1. It was a 12-cylinder water-cooled petrol engine which had a 810 horsepower in it, and it would have given this thing 32 kilometers an hour. Now, The general idea of this is not to be something which would go into the action. It would be put in overwatch positions, or it would support the main attacking force as stuff like the Centurions would go forward. This would create basic fire, where it would fire over the Centurions into the lines and helping them push forward. So this would not be like a front line vehicle like something like the Centurion. It was basically designed, as I said, to replace the Conqueror. That was the general idea, and it would have been pretty good for it. I mean, the Conqueror already did that job pretty well, so they probably just decided that, they just wanted to keep the Conqueror. But at the same time, having such a large gun and having such a completely new platform that had to be built, the logistical issues of this vehicle were way too high, and that is basically why this thing never came to fruition. The dimension of the weapon itself, the ammunition that it carried, the general size of it, they already struggled when it came to the Conqueror with its size, so they didn't want to have any more issues when it came to it. And also, by the time that this thing was being developed, like in the 50s, the IS-3 was not really seen as a threatening tank. They imagined, the IS-3 in 1945 to be this behemoth which was going to destroy everything, and, well, 12 years is a long time, and with a lot of other developments going on, by the time of 1957, where this thing would have been realized as a full prototype, the heavy tank idea, a lot of stuff had been developed to deal with those threats. Now, there was also another thing, a more economical option, and also new technology. And a lot of these things normally die off because of new technology being built, and as you can see, this was one of them. This machine here is the FV4010 or 4010, and also the Malkara. The Malkara was an anti-tank guided missile, and the FV4010, it was just a Centurion chassis which had no turret. It was turretless, and it was designed just to carry this ATGM, so it would have the same damage potential as something like the 183mm, but it would have better accuracy at long ranges. Now, this thing actually never made it into service, but the missile itself did, and this was seen as a much better option than something like the FV215, which is why, even though you had this mock-up, you had it all internally done, all of the designs were created for it, obviously the gun was already put on other vehicles, it just never made it to, the drawing board because, well, it got replaced by superior technology. It's pretty much as simple as that. Now, the next vehicle that we're going for is a Japanese one. Now, there is a ton of Japanese vehicles that you could pick when it comes to designs which were, never finished, or they were proposed and just never done. Some of them are in the game. The J6K1, the R2Y2, the Hori production. Those would be the easy ones to pick. Obviously, the OE, the super heavy tanks. A lot of people are probably interested in that. But here is one which is a little bit out of left field, and it's actually from Switzerland, who is one of the mods on the Tech Hub. This is a version of the A7M, which I find very interesting. This is the A7M3J, the Repu Kai. And what this was a proposed land-based interceptor version. It would be powered by the Mitsubishi HA43, and it would have 2,200 horsepower, so about 200 more horsepower than the A7M1, but very similar to the A7M2 Repu that I believe we also have in the game. But the armament, which is the main interesting part of it, consisted of 6 30mm guns, the Type 5 cannons, 4 which were wing-mounted, and then it would also have 2 in a Schrag music configuration. Now, obviously, during the war, Japan had a real issue dealing with high-altitude heavy bombers. The B-29, of course, by the end of the war, was in full operation, and it was annihilating Japanese production, and also the Japanese mainland. The B-17s and the B-24s, the B-29 B-24s mainly, was something that Japan always struggled against because of the fact that it was very hard for them to intercept them. So they came up with many different ideas to try and deal with these situations, and the Shrag Music was one of them. And this thing, with its very high-powered engine, with its massive armament, it would have been incredibly interesting to see because of it. There was a full-scale mock-up built, but not a prototype, but the guns obviously were made, the engine was mounted on other machines, so there is, and also it is a variant of a vehicle that we already have in game, the A7M series, so this already, would have a nice place in the game if they decided to go with the prototype or mock-up stage. There was also a bunch of super heavy bombers which you could add to the Japanese, just like the Germans if you wanted to go down the proposed route, but I think I'll save that for another day. The next one is one for America, and this is one which was actually fully built and also made. And the reason why I want to add it is because of its historical information. One thing that I really like about War Thunder is it's a great platform to help people learn about different vehicles and help people learn the history of warfare, or even just military or just general aviation or ground stuff. And this is one which I think would actually represent that pretty well. And what I would do is I would modify it from what it is. So what is this? This is the Bell X1. And if you don't know what the Bell X1 is, it was the first machine to exceed the speed of sound. And it was piloted by Chuck Yeager. It was the first manned airplane, I should say, to exceed the speed of sound, and it was one of the first of the X-planes, which were a series of American experimental rocket planes designed for testing new technologies. So this thing was completely, it was completely experimental in its nature. It didn't have any armament. It was actually described as a bullet with a rocket engine on it. It tried to go as fast as possible and also, keep everybody all alive. And the development of it actually, some of the development of it was actually, no, I don't really want to put it like that, but in 1942, basically, in the UK, they were working on something similar to the X1, at least the engine for it, and this came from a project from Miles Aircraft, where they were designing a turbojet-powered Miles M52. This was designed to reach 1,000 miles per hour, and Bell came over, had a look at the stuff, and they were already working on, on an engine to be able to push it as far as it could be. And the general idea of this machine is what you would do is you would take it to high altitude with a B-29, you would attach it to, the Bombay area, then you would drop it, you would set off the engine and then see how far it would go. Pretty much as simple as that. And try and get above the speed of sound. And that's what they did, obviously there was a bunch of test flights, just letting it, float down kind of like a glider, just to see how the plane would handle itself, and then they actually started, using the actual engine and working out how far they could push it. And eventually, the first manned supersonic flight happened in the 14th of October, 1947, and this was actually less than a month after the US Air Force had been created as a separate service. Chuck Yeager, or Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, as he was known, piloted the aircraft, and it was called Glamorous Glennis after his wife, and it was drop launched from the B-29, as you can see here, and it reached Mach 1.06. So the reason why I want this in game, if we're going to go down this route, is because of the fact that it was the first supersonic aircraft, basically, and you could just add armament to it, maybe some 50 cals, maybe some 20s, and it would be very similar to something like the BI. This thing also actually took off conventionally from a runway as well. It got to 23,000 feet in 90 seconds. So incredibly quick for a machine, but it does make sense that that was the case. It's pretty much just a bullet with a massive rocket engine on it. So yeah, I really would like to see this just because of the history and just because of the fact it would be a great learning tool for a lot of people who maybe don't know the history of supersonic flight, and also how quickly after the war America was, able to breach the sound barrier. There was a lot of projects which were designed to do it. There's even a few Messerschmitt pilots who believe that they did with absolutely no creditation at all. But this is the first proper supersonic aircraft, and I really think that should be honored in the game. The next one is this. Now, you may be asking what this is. Well, once again, we're going back to Britain, because of course we are. And this is the Miles M39B Libellula. And what this is an aircraft which was designed for a specification by the Air Ministry for a fast bomber. The general idea of this is that they wanted to create a vehicle which would be able to go incredibly fast and be able to drop a large payload and to not be able to be intercepted because of its speed. And this was actually supposed to be for Hawker, and it was going to be powered by 2 Napier Sabre engines, which were incredibly powerful at the time, and it was estimated to go 400 plus miles per hour at 25,000 feet. And it would have a 2,000-pound bomb load over 1,600 miles. So incredibly impressive. But it was cancelled. The Hawker prototype, which was working on this, the P1005, and therefore Miles, who was around at the time, he decided that he was going to submit his design to the ministry for the specification itself, which is pretty cool. Miles Aircraft, of course, as they were known. And so they put this design in, and in November of 1943, a full-size prototype was ordered, but it was never built. What you actually see before you in this picture is the M39B. And the M39B was a designed and built 5/8 scale version of the M39 idea. So this was kind of like a smaller version of what the bomber was going to be. It did fly on the 22nd of July 1943, and it seemed to work pretty well. The reason why the cockpit is like that is so it would be much easier to land. Obviously having being able to see is quite nice, and it's a very unconventional design, and designed for high-speed performance. You can see it in this picture here in the air. Now, this thing was actually supposed to be designed to have access to 3 Powerjet W2 turbojets, and but instead the design called for something slightly different. Instead of the turbojets, while they were waiting for them to be built and ready, they was going to use 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 inlines or Bristol Hercules 8 radial piston engines. And then the bomb bay was going to be in the center of the area, and it would also have access to 2 fixed 20mm cannons in the roots of the forward wings, which you can see in this picture. So this machine, the Libellula, was built, but it was built as a smaller scale version of the machine, which, was never built. And therefore, I think we could just extend the model and go into it. And basically, the whole idea of the design, it was a really great way of learning a lot of stuff about the general design and what they wanted to do with it. And the Ministry of Aircraft Production actually agreed a development contract and purchase of the M39B, and Miles continued testing it. He generated more flight data for it and all of this stuff, and the sole M39B was passed to the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough in 1944, and it was then damaged and repaired after 2 separate accidents, and then it was broken up with a full-size bomber project's cancellation. So this thing never went anywhere, but I think it's just a really cool vehicle. It looks awesome, and it would be really nice to see. The M39B actually had a different power plant as well compared to what it was supposed to have, because obviously it was a smaller model. This thing had access to 2 de Havilland Gypsy Major 1Cs. They had 140 horsepower each, so obviously a lot less power than, you know, it was going to have as its large scale version. This thing would have gone 164 kilometers an hour, showing, you know, once again, not its full potential. But I think you could definitely take this, upscale it into what it was supposed to be, and then chuck it in the game. That would be really cool. And it's also just a weird and wacky design, as I talked about, which would be really, really nice to see. And then we have something special. Now, what is this, you may ask? This is another insane design from Raoul Hafner. Now, if you don't know who Raoul Hafner is, he really liked stuff like gyrocopters. He was very much into it, and he designed a ton of stuff around it. He even created what is known as a rotate-chute, and this was, you would add a rotor rather than a parachute as a means of pinpoint landing troops of enemy territory. So you would attach a rotor to an individual and use them to basically fly around the place and, slowly get to the ground instead of a parachute. And for some reason, that somehow got a bit of success. And obviously it wasn't really used, but this is the first idea that it came up with, the Rotabuggy, or the Rotabuggy. And this was an idea where what they wanted to do is they took a Jeep, they converted it into an autogyro as a way of giving airborne forces some ground transport. So the initial flight trials with the Rotabuggy actually towed behind a Whitley bomber. Now, if you don't know about the Whitworth Whitley, it is one of those bombers I would love to see in the game. It is a pencil bomber. It was a pre-World War II machine and used during the Second World War, mainly to drop stuff like pamphlets. But generally, it's a really cool machine. I would love to see it. But the general idea of it is you would tow this behind a Whitley bomber, so then when the paratroopers went down, you would have access to some kind of mobile unit if you landed, and you could move about the place. Very similar to ideas such as the Tetrarch and things like that, but obviously from a slightly different point of view. And the prototype actually still exists in the UK. You can go see it, which is pretty awesome. But the problem with the Rotabuggy is it actually proved exhausting to the pilots, who had to hang on to the control column, which thrashed continuously around the cockpit. And on flights where the tow cable remained attached, there were some scary moments as the Rotabuggy on the edge of a stall touched down after the tow plane left and the driver took over. And the development of vehicle carrier gliders provided a safer and much more efficient way of getting Jeeps with more equipment, such as stuff like light-towed guns, to the battlefield. So therefore the Rotabuggy never saw service. But we're here to have a look at weird and wonderful designs, and to me, this one encapsulates it in its greatest way. So yeah, I thought, why not have a look at this? You could have these just go around the battlefield, maybe you attach some Lewis guns to it, maybe it becomes a 1.0 helicopter, you give it a little bit more power, so instead of just gracefully falling to the ground, it would be able to keep, its own weight up. Obviously, it wasn't designed for that, but you know what? We're in the world of fiction, so why not? So yeah, add a few Lewis guns to it, add a few bombs to it, let's go crazy, let's have a bit of fun. And it's just a really nice little idea, right? He even created good old Raoul Hafner, who was an Austrian which worked for the British Air Force's experimental establishment. He also created a rotate tank. And the rotate tank was a modified Valentine's tank, and this luckily never left the drawing board, so we wouldn't have our floaty boy Valentine tank either. And there is an honorable mention that I actually want to put in here. I've been reading a bunch of books when it comes to the like secret ideas of, you know, each different country, and one of them I thought was just really interesting and could actually have a pretty cool place in the game, especially now since the physical models of planes have changed, so you can actually like bend them around instead of hitting a plane and you instantly explode. And it's this one. This is from a book which is the Luftwaffe Secret Jets of the Third Reich, basically. And this is a part of it, page 113. These are the darts of death. And the darts of death, I mean, you can kind of guess what they're about, right? Basically, you create a machine. It has access to normally some kind of turbojet engine on the back or some rocket engine. You fly it up, you hit a bomber with it with the nose, which would obviously be reinforced, and be just a dart straight through the aircraft. That was the general idea of this machine, and there was a ton of different sketches done. They were trying to create an arrowhead, as you can see here, so you would be able to pierce through it and also survive the way down. And this idea was generally designed kind of like a lot of the other ones. I can't remember what it was called. What's the one with all the rockets in the front of it? Basically the Natter. Yeah, it was designed like the Natter. So you would take off, you would fire all of your rockets, and then you would, you know, parachute back down. And therefore the plane would, land gracefully somewhere, then you would load it up again and go back up. This was designed in the same way. So you would set it off with a pilot in it, you would go to the bomber formation, fly through planes and destroy them with the the plane itself, and then once the engine went out, you would either eject and leave it to fly down, or what you would do is you would parachute out and or just guide it down. Now this design, there were a ton of different ones. As you can see, it never left the drawing board. As you can see, there was a glider built by students to apparently test the aerodynamic qualities of the P-13 shape. Never actually designed as like a dagger or an arrowhead, which was, kind of interesting. So I don't know where this would fit when it comes to these designs, but I just thought it would be really cool and also add some cool gameplay mechanics. So yeah, that is that to me is a pretty interesting one, and that also brings us to the end of the weird and wacky stuff, which at least for me was either never built or needs to be modified in some way to be in the game. And it's always fun going through this stuff, and I think it would be nice to maybe go through some more in the future. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Elove Goat, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez B. Young, and also Hans Fagellen, Sebastian Mizon, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.